Welcome to today's webinar, Beyond Greenways, Next Steps for Urban Trails and Walking, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Jill Lemke, and I serve as the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. Our website is currently going through a transition, so stay tuned for updated Smart Growth news and content. This webinar is one of a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities at planning.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our program. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the State of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To receive AICP credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event. Transportation Equity. Whoops, that's the old event. You can also search for event number 928-0047. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. Our speaker for today is Robert "Bob" Searns. Bob has a 4-decade history of visualizing, planning, and getting trails and greenways built. He was project director of Denver's Platte River and Mary Carter Greenways, both national award-winning projects. He helped plan the Grand Canyon National Park Greenway, played a role in the Memphis Wolf River Greenway, and authored the Commerce City, Colorado Walk Bike Fit Master Plan. He co-authored Greenways, A Guide to Planning, Design, and Development, published in the US and China, and contributed to Greenways, the beginning of an international movement. He has written for Planning, Landscape Architecture, LA China, and American Trails magazines, and served as editor-in-chief of Trails and Beyond magazine. He's been a keynote speaker in the US and Asia, a trainer for the United States National Park Service and the Urban Land Institute. He was a founder of the World Trails Network and served as delegate of the America's Great Outdoors White House Conclave. He resides, writes, and hikes and bikes near Denver, Colorado. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. It's going to be a lot of fun presenting this to you guys. Maybe a little bit of background. You might have heard from my resume that my background was originally in designing, planning, and getting greenways built, mostly urban greenways. And maybe 10 years ago or so, I had the opportunity to go to Jeju, Korea, to a trails conference there and experience something I hadn't quite seen before. It was a Grand Loop trail. It was a few hundred kilometers that went around the edges of that resort destination island. It's about the size of Maui off the coast of South Korea. And I was just really impressed with that experience, that walking experience along the edges. And I began to think about, after that experience, the notion of greenways. I'd been doing them for 4 decades, and I was kind of wondering, what's next? How can we begin to expand on this? And another experience happened to me too as well. I was working on a walk, bike, and fitness plan for Commerce City, Colorado. It's a kind of a working class suburb next to Denver. And it was sponsored by some health agencies, and they wanted to promote fitness through routine, everyday engagement in outdoor activity. And I remember at that session, one of the public presentation sessions, a couple of ladies from the community coming up and saying, we just want a place to walk. We want a place that we don't have to jump out of the way of bicycles, where we know we can safely and comfortably walk. And that got me thinking too about maybe some kind of different notion and different geometry. And in thinking about all that, I decided to kind of put these ideas down on paper and begin to think them through. And again, I was inspired by the notion of walking, getting around just using your feet, something that obviously we've done for hundreds of thousands of years as humans. And I began to realize also, and began to see articles, and we're seeing them now just about every day in a magazine or a paper, about the benefits of walking, as well as biking, running, and hiking as well. Just the things they do for your mental attitude, the cardio benefits, and also just the notion of, I get a lot of my great ideas just out walking, that come to me, and I'm sure you do too. You just get in that kind of state where you begin to solve problems, and so that benefit is there. But we need infrastructure. We need infrastructure to enable that kind of activity, and also routine activity, as those ladies in Commerce City that I mentioned talked about. So basically, I began to put these thoughts down in a manuscript, and the wonderful folks at Island Press accepted the manuscript, and we've been working together to get this word out in the book Beyond Greenways. Basically, I see it as a new geometry, an evolving geometry for the Greenway movement, and a new type of park overlay. I like to call them front country ways. And again, it's built on the notion the core is walking. I like to think of walking as the human ATV. We're so flexible on our feet. You can get to a lot of places too with a mountain bike these days, but at the core, we're able to get around through multiple kinds of terrain just using our feet. And in thinking about this geometry, I began to think about 2 different elements. There's the notion of grand loop trails, and these are routes that follow the edges of cities where the city meets the countryside. And they have that potential to link open spaces, state parks, regional open spaces together. It's a way to have a close-in outdoors experience for urban dwellers. And then thinking back again to Commerce City for routine engagement, I began to think about the notion of town walks for routine access and use. And again, the geometry, rather than being linear, is more of a loop kind of geometry. And again, I mentioned they're primarily for walking, but that can include walking. I think of that as hiking, trekking, running, just any kind of foot travel. And of course, as I mentioned, there's a place where I think single track biking fits in, and equestrian uses as well. in thinking about it, a bunch of us actually went out and we decided to walk around Denver. We just went out on weekends. There's about 6 or 7 humans and 2 dogs that made this trip. And it was about a 150-mile trip all around the city. We went through the foothills, we went through the prairie, and it was such an amazing experience. It inspired me to kind of even take this a step further. And in putting together Beyond Greenways, I began to look around to see, it's just a crazy thought, or are other people maybe doing this? And I discovered that Phoenix has the Maricopa Trail that goes all the way around Phoenix. Las Vegas is building a Grand Loop Trail around its edges. Louisville, Rio de Janeiro has major pieces of a Grand Loop there. And I discovered that even 100 years ago, the Olmsteds, these were the descendants of Frederick Law Olmsted, proposed the 40-mile loop in Portland, which is now actually growing into a much larger loop around that city. And I began to think about, thought experiments. Could this happen in Dallas, Buffalo, Denver, Toronto, other places? I just saw an article in the New York Times, apparently in Paris, they're thinking about a kind of a smaller Grand Loop that will follow an old railway line. Hi again, everybody. The internet gods gave us a little bit of a challenge. I hope everybody can hear and see the slides now. John, are we working okay at this moment?
Yes, we are.
Great, thank you. And my apologies to everybody. Oh, we gotta love these digital things. I'm going to talk about a vision and maybe even a new direction that occurred to me. And this process started for me. I think you heard from my resume that I've been building trails and greenways for a lot of years. And more recently, in the past decade or so, I began to think about what are some other ways? How can the Greenway movement evolve? And part of what fed into this was an experience I had in South Korea, where I went to visit Jeju Island, and I was able to follow a wonderful walking route there called the Jeju Ali that goes around the edges of that tourist destination. It's several hundred miles, and you can walk along the edges from town to town. And I also began to think about how people can become healthier just by engaging in routine daily activity close in, having readily accessible walking routes in town, where every doorstep becomes a trailhead. And the emphasis was on walking, although certainly I'm a biker and biking is part of outdoor recreation as well. But I began to think after the experience in Korea, what about the notion of walking, just simply traveling with your own 2 feet? And, every day we're seeing articles in magazines and newspapers and on TV about all the benefits that are being discovered about walking, even though we've done it for millennia, particularly helping our mood, our cardiovascular health. I just like walking because it's a way to clear my head out, and I find that lots of ideas come to me and solutions come to me, and I'm sure that's true for you too, just when you get out and maybe walk for 30 minutes. But there's just wonderful benefits. I just read in the paper like 2 days ago that people with cancer, they're finding that if people diagnosed with cancer get out and walk and exercise regularly, their chances of survival increase substantially. So I think there's a real benefit there. And that takes infrastructure to accomplish that. And that's how I kind of got to where I got of putting together these thoughts in Beyond Greenways. And the wonderful people at Island Press worked with me to get this book published about thinking about a new mode of green infrastructure. It's a new geometry, a new type of park overlay. I like to call them front country ways because they're closer in and regularly accessible. And they also are based on the notion at the core of what I call the human ATV, walking. It's amazing how flexible we can all be on our feet. There are two components to the thought that evolved as I worked on this. And one is grand loop trails. And these are trails that go along the edges of cities, loops around cities where city meets countryside. They can link green nodes together like state parks and regional open spaces. And then closer in was the notion of town walks. And this is the idea, can we make every doorstep a trailhead by having branded quality places regularly accessible so people will exercise every day and realize those health benefits. And they're primarily, the emphasis is walking. By walking, I mean hiking, trekking, running, foot travel. And you could integrate single track biking and equestrian into the picture. In thinking about this, a bunch of us went out and decided to try walking a grand loop. We went out and there were about 6 or 7 adults and 3 dogs, and we walked around the Denver metro area where I live. We walked through the foothills, through those mountain environments, then the prairie environments, and did it on weekends over a 6-month period. It was incredibly amazing and just inspiring. And then in thinking about that idea, I looked around, I thought, oh, maybe this is just a crazy idea. But then I noticed that Phoenix has the Maricopa Trail, goes around Phoenix on the edges. Las Vegas is building a trail around its edges. Louisville, Kentucky, even Rio de Janeiro is looking at a loop that goes up through the jungles on the edges of Rio. And even in Portland, the Olmsteds, these were the descendants of Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of landscape architecture, who proposed a 40-mile loop around Portland. And Portland now is actually building that into a much larger loop. I also began to wonder about doing these in other places, Dallas, Buffalo, Denver, Toronto. Even Paris is now pursuing, I like to call this kind of a baby grand loop. It's a 20-mile loop that they want to build following an old railroad route around the core of Paris, where people can kind of get out, particularly on hotter days, to find a little relief in maybe a wooded walk around that city. Grand loops, as envisioned in the book, can take multiple configurations. Kind of the core vision is one that follows the urban edge around the edges of the urban area, as I mentioned, but they can also be hybrids. Maybe part of it goes through the city and part of it goes through the countryside. It kind of depends on the lay of the land. We can maybe then build connecting trails following existing greenways and trails, or building greenways and trails that go out to the edges of town, so urban dwellers and people who visit the core areas of cities can get out to the edge, maybe even take wedge walks where you go out, walk a section of the loop and walk back. And we could also maybe, this is something mountain bikers suggested to me, a daisy chain where maybe you attach sub loops that might be mountain biking courses along a grand loop. So there's multiple configurations where this kind of green infrastructure can work. I think they can be an alternative to the increasingly crowded and hard to get to destinations like national parks and national forests and those places that are farther out that require automobile travel and are also less accessible to a lot of people who have limited economic resources. Town walks, as I mentioned before, would be for everyday outings, just for routine exercise and solace. I think, and I've learned, that one of the best steps to good health is to walk every single day at least 30 minutes. You know, it's kind of like brushing your teeth. You need to get out there. But to get people to do that, we need to provide the places. So that was the second half of the concept I put together in Beyond Greenways. And these are town walks. And there's three types I'm describing here. Destination town walks could be around a feature, like a historic district. There might be closer in community walks that are branded quality walks that are kind of like a community park or a neighborhood park that are more easily accessible from home. And then thinking about just walking out your door and being able to walk every day. And I call those doorstep walks. They can take multiple configurations. We could have maybe a larger 10K loop in a town walk, and that could be divided into sub loops. We could maybe hang them off of greenways and other urban trails, these loops, or attach them to transit corridors where you could take the bus or the train to a location and do a walk, or maybe even use the transit line for part of the loop and walk the rest. And I tried doing all these things, by the way, and experimenting with this. Again, the notion is to make every doorstep a trailhead ultimately, so that these are readily accessible. One of my favorite examples of a town walk is the Turquoise Trail in Tucson. I went and walked this with some friends, and this was literally created by two history buffs, two ladies, and they got a hold of some paint that the city had, and they persuaded the city of Tucson just to simply paint a stripe on the sidewalk that connects the historic buildings, the barrios, and the other features of old Tucson together, restaurants. It's amazing, and it really just cost the cost of a little bit of paint. At the other end of the spectrum, some cities are building high-end town walks. Denver is building the 5280 trail. This may be a $100 million project that goes around the core and the important sites of the core area of Denver. I walked that corridor too. It's not yet built, but it will be amazing when it's completed. How did this concept evolve? Well, we can look at generations of what I call green space as an adaptive urban form, you know, a counterpoint to our workaday lives. And we can look back actually even to ancient China, going back over a millennia, where there were celebratory spaces in the cities where citizens could gather and get out of their houses. And that expanded in Europe with the boulevards, particularly in Paris, where they could take the garden notion to the streets. And it was a place where people could just get out and socialize and enjoy some greenery. And of course, those boulevards are now all over the world, from Buenos Aires to Washington to Paris. That I consider the first generation that evolved. The second generation, this was Frederick Law Olmsted, got the notion of beginning to create green corridors that would connect parks together in cities. And he saw these as a counterpart. This was during kind of the industrial days of the turn of the end of the 19th century. And, you know, it was really hard working in the factories and in these sort of grimy, dark, desolate places. And Olmsted wanted to have a place of green repose, at least on a weekend, where the citizens could get out and enjoy some greenery. And from that emerged the parkways notion. And there's wonderful Olmsted parkway systems. There's in Brooklyn, in Buffalo, New York, and other places. Oops, jumped ahead there. And then another generation, I think, emerged in the mid 70s, early 70s, and that's the Greenways notion, which kind of took the parkways notion to another step. These were kind of ways to convert linear corridors, mainly it was rivers and stream corridors, also rail trails, and transform them into people places, thereby kind of restoring the environment, but providing people with a place of repose. And in this era, rather than escaping from bleak industrial sites, it was a way to escape from the domination of the automobile, at least in my opinion. That's how I see it. And so what I kind of saw over the past several years and walking around Denver and in Korea and so on is a fourth generation, and that's the Grand Loops and Town Walks or front country ways that maybe can be another layer that can evolve out of this kind of urban geometry. As I said, greenways are primarily linear, rivers, rails, ridges. Most of them are hike and bike oriented. It's kind of a paved shared use trail. And they follow the grain of the terrain, you know, defined by topography, the river channels that were carved out. Grand loops, on the other hand, are circular. The geometry is not linear, it's mainly circular, and it's more of a foot travel emphasis, as I mentioned. And these systems actually go against the grain of the landscape. We try and find ways to form loops that link things together. In some ways, there's more flexibility if it's foot travel based. We don't have to have that same engineering that we need for a bicycle path. And ultimately, maybe these can all weave into networks, and we can also adapt and incorporate existing routes, and we have more flexibility. The other important aspect is I think there's more diverse, equitable access. If you don't have to travel 100 miles out of town or to get to a national park or some other kind of more wilderness kind of destination, these ones, particularly on the edges of cities, maybe are a little bit more accessible to diverse groups of abilities, income groups, ethnic groups, all of those kinds of considerations. And the other aspect that's really important to me is the notion of lightweight travel. Because these are close in and readily accessible, you don't need to take a heavy backpack, 50-pound backpack with you. The idea is it's day pack travel. On the edges of cities, there's usually little hamlets and towns and places, so you can even do a trek around a city and you can find a place to eat or a place to sleep in these places. And I'll get into that in a little more depth along the way. But the notion of lightweight travel or ultralight travel is very important in this picture. I think there's also the urban shaping node that we can begin to link places like regional parks and open spaces into kind of a green charm bracelet. Maybe it's a way to kind of revisit Ebenezer Howard's notion of green belts in maybe a more pragmatic way to do it. The other important aspect is the legacy of the right to roam. Increasingly, I think we're losing access of places to ramble about freely. And in Europe, there was an ethos of pathways and trails as a rite of passage. It was your right to move around. It may have come out of Scandinavia, not sure exactly where, but it's the notion of every man's right to walk anywhere. And those of you who maybe walked around in Europe know Ireland, England, Scandinavia, you have that greater freedom of motion. Although we're beginning to lose that. It's not only eroding in Europe, but in North America, and increasingly with, I think, people just more fearful or whatever. You know, you don't want to trespass on somebody's property. You might get shot. We see people getting shot regularly. Just knocking on doors. So that freedom to roam is hopefully something that front country ways and grand loops can help address. I'm going to talk briefly about planning and design. Let me just say the key, because I know I'm speaking to planners and designers, ultimately it's all about the experience. If you want people to use these things, you're really putting on a show. We're all in the entertainment business in that sense. It's about the experience, about the perception, the sensory experience, the views, amenities and comfort, having some variety, and also character districts. So there's a variety of different kinds of spaces you pass through. And one of the interesting things about grand loops and town walks is that you can create the sense of being in a natural wildernessy kind of space with buffering in the way you lay out a corridor. I learned that in planning greenways. We'd go down these river corridors, even through industrial areas, with all the landscaping and vegetation, it screened a lot of the urban spaces, so you had that sense you were in a natural space. And then when you assemble these, you can put together a kind of a symphony or compose a tune where places you have the long views, you have the short views. But this is an opportunity that these kinds of corridors can offer if they're properly planned. They need to be stimulating. They need to have waypoints, have destinations along the way are really important. So people have some motivation to get from one place to the next and a reward. And they can also connect together important destinations as a reward, and connecting schools, libraries, coffee shops, and strategic placement of those amenities. Speaking about components, as I said, with the human-powered ATV, we're more flexible. We can use a dirt surface. We can use it'd be not in cities, it should be an improved sidewalk though. We can use a gravel surface. We can even walk on streets, and I'll talk about walkable streets in a minute. And paved bike paths, the traditional kind of greenway paths fit into the picture, and of course, snow travel in the winter. Ideally, in my ideal world, we would build these grand loops so two people can walk side by side the whole way. And the surface is as level and as graded as we can get it. Maybe it's 4 or 5 feet wide with a natural or crushed fine gravel surface can work. Ideally, we separate bikes and peds in 2 separate treads. I know that's not always feasible and practical, but the notion of flow, that if you're walking, you don't worry about a bike coming up behind you. And if you're on a bike, you don't worry so much about being careful about pedestrians. So it's a thought, an ideal world that I guess I'd like to see us achieve. When we talk about town walks, we want something that's 5 feet wide with a tree median. So there's some buffering and shade, particularly with the climate issues, trees and shading. It's a way or a means to promote urban reforestation. There's a real partnership there. We can have upgraded and deluxe routes that are branded high quality routes, as Denver is doing, but they don't have to be $100 million. I think you can do less costly ones as well. And here's an interesting aspect, is the notion of walkable streets. In a lot of places where you have low traffic volume, low speeds and visibility, the street can become the path. And you need to work and partner with the traffic and transportation engineers. I just gave a presentation to a highway department, a state highway department, and the engineers that attended were very enthused about this. They want to break out of kind of just designing for cars and trucks. It's important to think about the users from the standpoint of creature comforts. And you know, you go out and walk these routes yourself. See when you get hot, when you get hungry, using the restroom, particularly with an older population, that's incredibly important now, is having those places. And shelter and shade. And I want to add to that, places to duck out when the weather gets bad. It might help overcome the notion of walking range anxiety that many people feel. Oh, I can't go out and walk that far. I just can't do that. What'll happen if it gets cold or it rains or whatever? So we want to think about that. Wayfinding is a must. And I'm kind of all for physical wayfinding, not just people using your mobile device. It's kind of nice not to have to carry that and look at it. And what if the battery goes dead anyway? To have some kind of low-key markers. They don't have to be expensive. It's like that green stripe in Tucson. Or it could be very fancy, like Kamado Kodo in Japan, where they have a core destination branding item. As you can see, it's a 100-foot high object. So think about that. And all the needs, again, go out and walk it yourself. That's the way to find out of what is needed along the way, and the spacing of them and the distances. So it's really important, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a publicly built facility. Maybe it's just a restaurant or you know, a coffee shop or a convenience shop along the way that can work. And of course, we want to think about accessibility. In the case of town walks, they always have to meet ADA standards of accessibility. In the case of grand loops, that is not always possible and feasible to make all of the backcountry trails accessible for all levels of ability. But what we can do is plan for parallel routes that maybe bypass those challenging areas with a better surface. How do you get people to use these? How do you encourage people to use them? I think if we're going to promote and sell these and make them go viral, people have to use them and want to use them. And sadly, right now, even though 6 out of 10 people do participate in regular activity, there are tens of millions of people who don't participate. This is particularly true amongst a number of minority groups that aren't engaging, with terrible health consequences. So we want to think about what motivates people. And by the way, it's not the shoulds or oughts. Oh, if you don't do this, you'll be overweight or you won't be healthy. No, it's the pleasure of the experience or the socialization of the experience that motivates people. And that's what we got to think about, is having those opportunities for getting out there and getting those rewards to the people when they go out there. That's what's going to get people routinely exercising, not a warning about that, they're going to have high cholesterol or get diabetes. I mean, that might help with some people, but with many people it won't. In those destinations, one of the writers I've read about, a fellow named Mark Fink, talks about the third place concept. Our first place is our home. Our second place is where we work. The third places are those social gathering areas. It might be a coffee shop or a restaurant or a pub. It's a place where people gather, a library. So we want to think about those as waypoints and destinations. We want to promote people doing this daily, because that's when you get the health benefits. As I say, it's like brushing your teeth. You really got to do it regularly. And here's a critical part of it, is having access and transportation, ideally through the transit system. And there have been trains to trails and buses to trails programs. We want to think about having places, bus lines, where people can take the bus out to a grand loop on the edge of town and do that trek. So basically, when we think about designing these things, we want them welcoming, we want them accessible, we want high quality, we want connectivity. Okay, I cheated there. And they need to be stimulating if we want people to use these. How do we make them happen? Well, you guys as planners know that, first of all, I think we have more flexibility and we can promote that notion. It's not necessarily as costly as building a bike trail with the human-powered ATV. And we want to plant the seed with an inspiring vision. Catalytic projects, build them right the first time, and that hopefully will spread. And finding the seed funds to do it. There are funds around, maybe it's philanthropic, maybe it's some other kind of grant, but building logical proof of concept projects. They got to be usable, and try and cut a ribbon at least once a year, so there's some credibility that you're going to get this thing built. Sometimes you can create a town walk or a grand loop just by closing some critical barriers, because there may be connections already in place. This is true in Denver, where even though there's no formal adopted grand loop plan for the metro area, many of these places, all you need is a connection here and there, and you'll have a connected system. Adapting existing infrastructure. I mentioned earlier the notion of walkable streets, just being able to adapt because we don't have to build those high-tech kind of hike, bike, paved paths always. And the benefits are clear. It's an investment. If you're going to be selling this to your communities and your decision makers, it is a kind of green infrastructure. There are tourism benefits, like I talked about in Tucson, neighborhood improvement. I mentioned the social place making and the fitness benefits. And we talked about the other benefits of it. It's an alternative to those more crowded destinations. And think about youth and volunteer engagement projects, and also the healing benefits, maybe to people with military people who have trauma, getting out and not only walking, but maybe working on helping to build these trails and helping to reduce that $4.3 trillion in healthcare costs in the United States. We got to get out of silo thinking. This means working with other disciplines, transportation people, tourism people, health and fitness people. All those can be partners. And we also need to think about that urban shaping, flood control and wildfire management. If we begin to create open spaces, those charm bracelet spaces, maybe they're grazing commons where we have open spaces where livestock are helping to keep prairie grasses shorter for less fire hazard. The sponge city notion of wetland management. We need those spaces, and these trails, maybe these grand loops, maybe help encourage that because people can benefit from those spaces by linking them together. Rehabilitation spaces for troubled youth, I mentioned that. And people with PTSD, and that's been done. There's some great examples in France and Korea of having done that. And climate resilience. Are these places like in Paris? They want places where people can find some shade and get out of their hot apartments and that kind of thing. Think about the arts, partnering with the arts and events. There's just all kinds of opportunities. I'm going to kind of wrap up now. I hope I still got a little bit of time. I know we had a little delay at the beginning there, but hopefully we're okay.
Bob,
Just
you have a lot of time.
Experience,
Bob, you have a lot of time.
Oh, good. Okay, I'll slow down a little bit. On page 195 of Beyond Greenways, I wrote a whole chapter about thought experiments, about imagining these in places where they really haven't been built yet. And on page 195, I laid out a course around Buffalo, New York. It's kind of a Rust Belt city, and it is kind of making somewhat a renaissance. And I said, I got to put my feet where my mouth is and go out and actually walk around one of these places and see what will happen. So about a month ago, I hopped on a plane. I live in Denver, flew out to Buffalo, and I plotted out a route. It's a 120-mile route. I just finished it up a week ago. Just flew back from completing that 120 miles. I used Google Maps to help lay out the route. It was just an incredible help. There's so many technologies now that weren't here even 10 years ago in the same way that allow us to do these kinds of things. And I started walking. My nephew who lives there joined me for part of the way. This is Buffalo, New York. Everybody thinks of old, decrepit, rusting steel mills. Well, no, this is what it's like out on the edges of Buffalo. It's one of the most beautiful rural scapes, that's 15 miles from downtown. You can get to these spaces, and just incredible kinds of experiences along the way. I stayed at a bed and breakfast that was allegedly haunted in one town. I think the ghosts were off duty that night, unfortunately, although I did get some sleep. And also, this was a system that combined existing pieces. I think I mentioned that, where you can maybe connect together existing systems like the Empire State Trail that follows the Erie Canal all the way across New York State, and was able to walk along that. And there's opportunities along these trails to kind of reinvigorate and refurbish townscapes. And then I also went through urban and industrial areas. This was kind of a hybrid loop, as you saw from my earlier drawings that I showed. And in a way that made Buffalo even more interesting. I'm not sure I would have wanted a totally green rural experience along the way. It was kind of neat to walk through the older parts of the city as part of that route as well. And fortunately, Buffalo's built a wonderful trail along the Niagara River and going down toward Lake Erie. So I was able to use that as part of the route. Just an amazing experience the whole way. So I learned some lessons on that walk in laying out the trek, this trek for myself, just thinking about anybody who does this. And if you think about doing it, you really do need to prepare so that you're both comfortable and safe when you do this kind of thing. Google Maps, as I mentioned, was priceless, particularly the little yellow guy that you can take and put on the street so you can get a look at the street scene and see what the conditions are, how walkable it might be, if there's a sidewalk, that kind of thing. You need to plan those, what I call waypoints, places to stay, find hydration, go to the bathroom, or duck out if there's a storm. I also discovered from walking that about, at least for me, 10 to 12 miles, and I think probably for most people, is about the optimal distance every day. You could go longer, but I think that just seemed to have the right rhythm to it. And also, I think anybody just about any age who can walk or ability can do that 10 or 12 miles. And as I mentioned, establishing waypoints. There needs to be those places along the way. They have I call it my Tim Hortons waypoints. They have these Tim Hortons. They're kind of like the Starbucks and other places. They're coffee shops in the Buffalo area. And I kind of plotted, I put coffee shops on the mapping, because I knew that would be a place that you could get something to drink or eat, use the restroom, so figuring out where those are. Ride shares, I don't think I could have done it without Lyft and Uber. They were a huge help. So you want to check and see about the availability of those. It turned out around Buffalo, they were available everywhere. And that was fascinating as well. I'm going to write a whole other piece about that. But I did notice, by the way, I mentioned walking on roads, at least in the Buffalo area, some of those country roads can be busy, even though you wouldn't think they are. And so I made sure I walked facing the traffic. I mean, they weren't prohibitively busy, and I'd like to find even quieter places, but bear that in mind in your planning too, that it would be nice to have separate places wherever you can do it, separate corridors that are maybe buffered from the street. Also, when you think about lodging, I mentioned one of the nice things about Grand Loops is that you can stay in established hotels or B&Bs, the haunted one I stayed at. But bear in mind, you want to coordinate your walking so that you leave, a lot of these places you can check out at 10 or 11 in the morning. And, if you walk for 3 or 4 hours, you want to make and maybe have lunch, check-in times, a lot of places is 3 o'clock. So you want to figure that out in the timing. You absolutely have to have a mobile device with you. And I carried an extra battery and actually an extra old phone because you don't want a dead battery out there. So, and prep, just preparing with the right clothes, but keeping your weight down. I wanted to keep the weight to a day pack weight. The water actually was the heaviest thing. For planners, I think the lessons I learned on this walk is make sure the routes are attractive. And particularly automobile noise is a big one in thinking about these things. But also just the scenery. And as I said, it doesn't all have to be wilderness. Urban scenery can be attractive too. But remember, you're laying out a song, you're laying out a symphony when you plan these things. So think about that. And then think about the syncopation of the places, those waypoints, and the links that connect them together. And that gets into the notion of character districts along the way. There are all kinds of different kinds of spatial characteristics, from that urban scape to a wilderness feel, maybe of a stream valley along the way. Think about how you connect those together and how you're going to highlight those or take advantage of them. And of course, safety and security is a must. And I mentioned already is hiker needs and access to provisions along the way. Think about both the users and the motorists. One of the things I noticed when I was walking on some of these country roads, I always walked against the traffic so I could see the cars coming. I noticed that some cars would kind of swerve away from me. They didn't need to, but they were. And that concerned me because I didn't want them to swerve into the path of an oncoming car. So think about that. Be working with the transportation and traffic engineers, and ideally try to find those lower speed streets where you can do this. But it's a challenge, and you know, you guys can hopefully take this a step beyond my walk and begin to figure out how to address those challenges. And I also noticed on the Buffalo Walk, the stream corridors along the way and shorelines, and how those could lend themselves to become future greenways and open space corridors. Because in Buffalo and probably a lot of other cities, there are segments of these that could attach things together. So we could leverage this grand loop around Buffalo or any other city into a green belt, a green loop. Anyway, that's my little talk, and I'm happy to take questions, answers, ideas, whatever.
Great, thank you, Bob, for a really great presentation. A lot of really great ideas and examples. I love the idea of having the trail start at your front door. So throughout the webinar, we've been assembling questions from our audience. So let's get to the question and answer session. Please continue to submit questions during the discussions, and we'll get to as many as we can until 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So let's get started. I have a lot of good questions all queued up. Before I start, I'll say I am from Buffalo, New York, and grew up 13 miles east of downtown Buffalo, so I recognize some of those.
Oh, wow.
Potential paths you were walking on. So one of the questions is, how do you balance forested trails and conserving forest patches and forest fragmentation, especially with concerns about invasive species and water quality issues?
Wow, you know, I think that's a double-edged sword. You know, there's two aspects of it. And I'll address what I think was the first part, that do trails do damage and fragment networks. And I think that, and again, this is where a multidisciplinary approach is really critical. Engage ecologists, and most areas, there are environmental agencies that have assessment maps and that sort of thing, so that you can at least highlight and make sure that you're avoiding highly sensitive areas, and also providing buffers between where people are going to be that might disturb wildlife, or, you know, and those kinds of impacts. And I realize that people on trails can track in invasive seeds and that kind of thing. I think we do our best to do some buffering, and maybe go back and do kind of like wetland mitigation to restore areas. You know, the other side of the coin, and by the way, speaking about wildlife too, I'll just mention that too. One wildlife ecologist told me that, think about what you would want in terms of your privacy. You know, you don't want to be seen eating, reproducing, sleeping. You want that buffering. Think about the same way with wildlife, that providing those buffers, and maybe it's tree canopy or vegetation. Having said all that, on the other side of the coin, I think that by providing these kinds of walking spaces, we can create a constituency to preserve these areas. And it's another, I think, arrow in the quiver in the fight. For example, if you can preserve wetland areas as part of a grand loop and promote them not only as a place to absorb floodwater, but also a scenic spot along a trail. So I think, look at both sides of it. Design with minimal impact. I think also, by the way, I've been reading a lot about urban reforestation. Use these corridors as opportunities to create new planting areas. We've actually engaged volunteers and youth groups coming out and replanting and reestablishing areas. And in the cities, I think what we want to do is make these town walks shaded and kind of create them as forested loops as best we can, because the trees help cool. It's amazing when you walk under a tree. When I walked around Buffalo, it was really hot. There was a heat wave there when I was there, and it was such a relief to get under a tree. So it's a double-edged sword. And think of all the ways you can partner with reforestation, with water conservation, with wildlife people to make it a win-win.
Great. There's another question that has to do with trees and shade, and you brought up some good points. Somebody asked, do you have any tips for getting trees along the walk and paths? And they state, our DOT will add greenways to the highway projects, but they are often on clear-cut land in direct sunlight. Trees can bring a lot of maintenance and watering requirements. Any tips for something like that?
Well, I think we have to think of trees increasingly as infrastructure, and they take that investment. I was actually involved on the Platte River Greenway in Denver, which I was the project coordinator for. We did a project called 10,000 Trees, where we actually went in and literally planted, we got volunteers to plant 10,000 trees. And yes, we did have to put in irrigation. Yes, somebody has to manage them. But trees, particularly with their cooling benefit, you have to look at the costs and benefits in selling these, I think. That what is the cost of not having that shade? So again, it's kind of that double-edged sword thing. But getting volunteers to plant them, you know, when we did the volunteer tree planting, we got different companies to sponsor different segments of the Greenway, and these different companies would send out their employees, and they would actually sponsor a segment. So they would put up the money. And ideally, maybe you can create a maintenance endowment. Is there a simple answer? No. But do we need these, especially in view of climate change? Yes. And again, I'll throw that back out at all of you. Let's put our creative ideas together and figure out a way to do it. You know, I think that's going to be part of making our cities livable if we do it.
Agreed. I had a question about the French and Korean models, and someone else had a similar question, so I'm going to read them both. What is unique and inspiring about the French and Korean models? And then can you provide the examples or names of the rehabilitation spaces in France and Korea?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that friendship part, I didn't hear that. You broke up a little bit. Friendship.
Oh, what is unique and inspiring about the French and Korean models?
Oh, French. Okay. Yeah. Wow. I'm so glad you asked that question. I met on my way to Jeju Island. I met a guy named Bernard Olivier. He was a retired French journalist from Paris, and at age 62, he was forced, you know, kind of forced to retire. Was kind of the protocol there. At the same time, his wife died, and he was despondent, thinking of ending it all. And he went out and he walked, you know, to kind of heal himself, the Camino de Santiago, and that really wasn't enough. So then he decided he was going to walk across South Asia from Istanbul to Zhuan, China, following the Silk Road. It's about a 7,000-mile trek. He actually wrote a great series of books about that, starting with, I have a copy of it somewhere, but anyway, it's out of Istanbul. It's the first one in French. It's the Long Marché. And Bernard, in fact, inspired me to do this whole thing. And every time I thought about walking around Buffalo, I said, oh, I can't do this. You know, I'm just some old guy. I can't. And I thought about Bernard doing this, and he walked 7,000 miles. So that just kept me going. But putting that aside about the healing part, when Bernard got back to France, he created a foundation. I think it's called the Soulé Foundation. And it was, instead of the delinquent youth being put in jail, they were assigned to go on a trek with Bernard and his people, a multi-month walk as their healing process. And apparently it's been very successful. And I understand South Korea has adopted a similar model. that we get people out on a, kind of facilitated journey where they're walking with somebody like Bernard's people. And that's the healing process. And I mentioned also vets and other people who face PTSD, that kind of healing.
Right. There's a question that's kind of come up as a theme throughout some of our other webinars recently. In Maryland, October is Walking Month, and it's called Walktober. This question sort of goes along with some of the themes we've heard earlier. How do you get traffic engineers and drivers to accept the idea of walkable streets? Our pedestrian infrastructure isn't always in the best condition, but drivers push back against people walking in the street.
Yeah. Well, first of all, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I really want this, and I'm so glad that, for example, in my state, the Colorado Department of Transportation invited me to come talk to their engineers. I think one-on-one is really important. I think getting an influential champion, whether it's an influential political leader or somebody with the political authority that's going to back you up, going and seeing everything, I think, is also about horse trading and seeing what kinds of exchanges you can make. And yes, there are motorists who will object to bicycles in the street or pedestrians in the street because they are inconvenienced. And I think that's a sorting out process. There's, I think at one end of the spectrum, you don't want to interfere with, where businesses feel they're going to suffer, or certain streets and arterials need to have certain capacities. But in other places, I think it's sort of just introducing the idea. But you have to make sure that, that you've assessed the speed limits, the widths, and that's why you want a traffic engineer on your team right from the start, because they can speak the language. And and I talk a little bit about this in the book. I did consult with some traffic engineers writing the book. Is the language you use, how you describe these. I'll say this again, I'll throw this out to all of you, but build partnerships. Have things to trade and exchange, and try and be as practical as you can, but also don't back down. I think we've got to make this change for so many reasons. We can't have a totally automobile-dominated society. It's just not going to work.
Agreed. Someone has asked if you could go back to the slide you showed some of the recommendations for funding and seed grants. And they're asking if you could just talk a little bit more about those kinds of ideas. And someone has asked if you have any ideas on federal monies that might be available for ADA trail improvements, because to make trails ADA accessible.
Yeah, I'm trying. Can you see my screen?
We cannot. I think you need to share again.
Okay. I don't know if I can push that button, but I can at least maybe. Yeah, there we go. Show my screen. There we go. Yeah, I mean, this doesn't have, obviously.
I think if you hit slideshow, so because we're seeing your whole screen, not just the slideshow.
I'm sorry?
We're seeing your whole screen, not just the slideshow.
Yeah, I'll make that bigger. And let me see if I can slide it over. I'll just make it bigger so you can see, everybody can see it.
Why don't you just hit from
again,
current slide? Bob, just hit from current slide right above, second from the, oop, you moved it.
Okay.
See where it's, yeah, just click that. That's exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah, so, there is funding out there. There are places to find funding. And as I mentioned, because of the flexibility of these kinds of projects, sometimes you can start with something more basic to demonstrate it, as long as it's got some quality to it. I don't have the answers specifically about today's, God, what's going on at the federal level, who knows? But today's ADA accessibility funding, I think you guys have more expertise currently than I might have on that. You know, and there are federal programs, they do come along. God knows what will happen in the next few years, and we all know what's going on, so I won't delve into that. I think philanthropic funding has been pretty rich in a number of areas. I know that the East Coast Greenway has gotten a phenomenal amount of money in, you know, we were talking about Buffalo, the Ralph W. Wilson Foundation. You have to kind of spot those, but you got to take them a vision. You have to have something compelling to sell these people on and the potential that it can get done. You know, I think also, you know, some places, a number of places around the country have created sales tax revenue increments. I know in Colorado, we raised millions of dollars that way with county sales taxes. You know, maybe it's a quarter-cent increment. That's one of the best ways that I've seen it done. And these have been incredibly popular with the voters, even in conservative counties. Surveys have shown that 60% of the voters will pay for a sales tax increment. So getting that steady funding like that, I think, is really important. And thinking about some of those local kinds of fundings that you can do. I think you need to have both public and private funding. You can't usually fund everything with philanthropic money. The private side people want to see there's a public commitment as well, because they want to know it's going to be maintained. Like all the other things we talked about, there's no simple answer, but I like to put an emphasis on, you know, finding local sources and creating local sources at the state level and at the county and city levels with things like sales tax increments. But you got to have that vision. You've got to take it out and sell it. And again, you need champions. You know, I go into this in more depth in the book, but finding people that are influential people that also can horse trade with some of the other political decision makers to find that revenue. We've built a lot of multi-million-dollar projects like the Platte River Greenway in Denver. We started with virtually nothing, and we're able to got private sector seed money to start it out from a foundation, and then, you know, that kind of leveraged other people to join on.
Great. Those are some good tips.
Thank you.
We have a question that sort of relates to an experience here in Baltimore. The National Park Service has created a water-based trail in the Baltimore Harbor. And we have a question here that says, have you seen good examples of integrating waterways with greenways or vice versa?
Well, there's just multiple ones all around the country. I guess I'll talk about the one I know about is the Platte River Greenway in Denver, and it was, you know, that runs through the whole metro area. And one of the goals was to make it not only walkable and bikeable, but boatable the whole way, cutting dams. And actually, you can take a low-head dam, which is a killer. You know, there's low dams. They have a hydraulic that will drown people because of the way they're designed. We would cut them and create stair steps. So you go down in little, maybe 18-inch increments rather than a 10-foot drop, and that can become an actual whitewater play area. And so that's been my experience. There's the Blue Way in Florida that goes around Florida. You know, there are multiple ones just in about every state, everywhere. One thing that occurred to me in doing the thought experiment in Chapter 8 with Sarasota, Florida, is that might be an opportunity to combine paddling with walking, and it may facilitate it. There's a lot of shoreline in Sarasota, so that you could maybe have an outfitter that, you know, that's part of it, is maybe gets you a kayak and you paddle a portion. There's also the Myakka River and other waterways there that could be part of a grand loop around Sarasota that would be both a walking path and a boating path. So maybe you can combine the two together.
Right. Great, thank you. There's another question. Are there any examples on the continent of Africa that you're aware of where walking is usually the only way to travel for low-income members of the population, not necessarily for recreational purposes?
Well, yeah, and I didn't really get into walking as transportation, but obviously there is a transportation element to this with walking, particularly if those grand loops you build can take you to this, I mean, grand loops, the town walks can take you to a marketplace or other destination that you routinely use. In Africa, I think there's all different levels. You know, South Africa, I know, has been a real leader in creating, these are recreational and tourist-oriented trails networks. Galio Saints is a leader, you can Google his name, who's done a lot of that in South Africa. You know, I don't have the expertise to speak about, you know, indigenous communities that walk, other than it helped inspire me when I walked around Buffalo. I thought about the people who, you know, that walk 20 miles a day because it's sort of part of their survival. I don't know of any, maybe you guys do, of institutionalized walking, but I do, and I'm really interested in the notion of walking as sustainable tourism in places like Africa. You know, obviously there are practicalities with that. If you're going to see some of the charismatic wildlife, like in Kruger National Park, it's not really very safe to go out for a walk. You might get eaten,
Right.
literally, because I've been there. But there are places, I think, in the whole continent of Africa that you could provide that. I did a number of great walking treks in areas that weren't, you know, where there were dangerous wildlife in South Africa. And, you know, in one case, I was working with the operator of a bed and breakfast, and they provided a walking facility out their door, and we had a wonderful trek. And we did a lot of walking around the communities in South Africa along the beaches. So, you know, long story short, I guess I would think about both providing the citizenry, particularly in the urban areas, with places to walk for fitness and health, but also talking about the notion, a big part of the revenue in Africa is tourism, and thinking about walking travel as a big part of it, and building these routes to accommodate that.
Right. Do you have any experience in, I'm going to ask my question now. I have a passion for preserving blue collar jobs. I come from Buffalo, where there was a lot of blue collar employment. And in Baltimore, we struggle with providing access to waterfronts and things where they might interfere with our very active world-class port. Do you have experience or tips on how to plan for safe walking or biking in an area where industry is still in existence? How can the two live side by side safely?
Well, having built a trail through a working gravel mine, I have had some kind of experience with that. You know, it's all in the way you design it. And remember what I said, that every foot of the trail doesn't necessarily have to be a park-like or wilderness experience. You know, obviously, like in Buffalo, as you know, you do need to bypass some of those port areas because there's functioning port activities. So maybe you go off to the side somewhere and it's not the beautiful water view for that distance, but I know in Buffalo what they did provide is some interpretive displays that describe what's there, and maybe creating nodes where you can access and view things and see things that are there. So you're going to showcase these industrial things if it's appropriate, and interpret them, explain them. But, you know, maybe at that point you have to just go around that hazardous area. You know, what was more troubling to me, like in Buffalo, the Buffalo example is south of Buffalo along Lake Erie. It was sad because every inch of the waterfront had a cottage or a house on it, so you could not, virtually, so you could not see Lake Erie. And that was because I think there was not the foresight, you know, 70 years ago when these lots were developed to preserve that. Yeah, there's a couple beaches there you can get to. But I think there's a long-range planning thought about how do you, and it's that right to roam I mentioned earlier, how do you think about providing and setting aside those open spaces? And that's kind of policy, I think, in some of the zoning. And it's an uphill battle, you know, you're battling that everywhere, sadly, where the money seems to take precedence over, you know, what maybe the citizens we should have. So it's a complex question, but think flexibility, think figuring out go-rounds, think highlighting some of these features. And in some cases, like I say, we worked with the operator of a gravel mine to make a safe passageway through the gravel mine. Now, the gravel miner wanted some deals from the city, so it's kind of making exchanges. Same thing with rail routes. You know, sometimes you have to, I like to say you have to ask 6 times. They'll keep telling you no, 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 but maybe if you can come up with something to horse trade.
Right.
And we've done a number of other ones where we've worked with miners and industry. We have a path that goes through an oil refinery on another project I built. And we consulted with the safety people about evacuation if there's a problem there. So I think these problems can be solved. A lot of it's the liability question. And there are different laws that do protect people from liability, the recreational use statutes.
Great. Those are some excellent tips.
Thank you.
Somebody is asking for additional perspective on the same types of situations and getting active walking, the right to roam, as you say, through active farmland. And have you had experiences working with farmers to convince them that it's okay for people to walk through their land?
Yes, I have, and it is, you know, again, it's a huge challenge because, you know, agricultural activity, people think of kind of the bucolic farmhouse or whatever, but they're really industrial activities, a lot of them. And they're going to be spraying pesticides or fertilizer. They also don't want people coming in. And we went through one farm area where people were concerned about people coming and stealing their produce. So I think you need to, again, work one-on-one with the farmers, the operators of those properties. Maybe it's some kind of security fencing, and I don't mean chain link. You can maybe do with a more rural kind of fencing, providing buffers. There are all little design techniques that you can do. Again, reminding them of the recreational use statutes if they're worried about liability, which is a concern. One interesting thing, we were doing an open space plan, a number of us a few years back, for a rural area, and a number of farmers showed up, and I kind of thought they would be hostile, and it turned out a couple of them said, when is this going to come near me? Because they wanted to have some kind of revenue, maybe from having a B&B or, you know, some kind of agricultural based tourism. I'm not going to over romanticize agritourism, but there, you know, look at all the angles and look at all the things you have to trade. It's all about trading, making deals, and also it's about the landowner saving face. They want to feel that they've been respected and that you understand their needs. So reach out one-on-one. When we've done plans through rural areas, I always map all those agricultural properties, get the names of all the owners, and, you know, the key owners. You know, you can't contact every little tiny lot, but the larger ones. And I called them, I phoned them, I emailed them, I texted them, and got into discussions with them. A lot of times in the public meetings, it doesn't work as well because sometimes there are hostile people that deliberately come to those meetings just to kind of stir up trouble. It's happened to us a number of times, particularly in rural areas. So again, all the listeners, I know you guys have a lot of expertise in this area, but I guess the word is what's in it for them? Where's the win-win? How do you make them feel safe and secure? Not easy answers, but I've built a number of these and we've been able to overcome it, you know, by making deals and listening to them.
Great, thank you. Someone has asked, is there a difference between a path versus a sidewalk on the right-of-way? In their example, they have 3-foot right-of-ways, which are too narrow for ADA's sidewalks, but maybe a 3-foot stone or dust path. Any suggestions or comments for that type of situation?
Well, in my ideal world, 3 feet is too narrow. I always think of 2 people side by side, and also people who maybe need some kind of device, 2 wheelchairs to pass each other, and that's you got to do that, I think, in town, and out in the more rural areas, there may be terrain where that's not always practical to do. So I guess, in the book, I'm striving for the ideal, but also recognizing that sometimes you can't always achieve that. So you do the best you can, but make sure that the experience is a decent experience. And I can't stand these mountable curb sidewalks. They put the curb and gutter in some little 2-foot piece of walk we have them in the neighborhood I'm in, and we just walk in the street because it's sort of silly to walk on these things. So I think as my friend Mark Fenton likes to say, he's a walking expert, you got to have that foundation of policy. And that's getting the word out and working with the influential leaders and making the case of why increasingly, especially with the health benefits of investing in comfortable walking spaces that are buffered from traffic and going for that minimum 5 feet. So I don't know, again, I don't have a simple answer to that, but I know what we want to strive for and what we don't want to accept is okay, particularly those, mountable curbs, for example, that aren't walkable. And 3 feet to me is just too narrow. There may be places, if it's a 3-foot primitive trail in the mountains or something, yeah, maybe there's some places that's all you can do, and you also don't want to scar the environment by making it wider. But that's where your skills as planners and designers comes into play too.
Right. There's a couple questions related to increasing interest in micromobility and e-bikes. Have you seen a lot of increased demand for pathways that include surfaces for scooters and e-bikes?
Yeah, I think that's a real, to me, it's a real concern. I think the upside is that e-bikes and scooters and micro-mobility getting around town, they provide that. To me, a scooter is like a bicycle. It's a means of mechanized travel. And so I think they should not be on sidewalks. And same thing with bicycles, not be on sidewalks. So you need to provide that space. And a lot of cities are providing those discrete spaces. The thing about e-bikes, they enable a lot more people to be out on the trail. I'm concerned about the speed and weight. I think we do want to regulate e-bikes so we're not getting anything heavier than a mountain bike weight, and speed with those because of the hazards that might pose. On the other hand, it enables a lot more people to have access. So again, I think it's working with, and I've done some webinars on American Trails with this, working with the manufacturers and the mountain biking and associations and organizations, and not being tribal about it, but trying to find mutual solutions. But my goal is to, wherever we can from a practical standpoint, separate people on foot and maybe horseback from mechanized vehicles. Because I think, whether they're foot propelled or they're battery propelled, they're really mechanized vehicles. So, and I'm not anti-bike, I'm just saying that, or scooter, I think we need to sort them out. They each have their place, but if we have too many conflicts, then people won't walk if they're jumping out of the way of a mechanized vehicle. And I think people who want to get somewhere fast on a scooter or a bike, they're going to have the same feeling. So we want to try and accommodate both. Tall order,
Yes.
but that's the tall order I put out to all of you.
Well, thank you so much. This gets us to a point where we can start wrapping up because we're approaching 2:30. I want to give you a chance to give some closing remarks based on the questions or anything you might have thought of that you hadn't covered that you wanted to let us know about before we break.
I just want to say I really appreciate all of you tuning in and listening. And again, I'm hopefully planting a seed, a concept, but you know, it's something that can evolve, change, and needs a lot of solutions still. And that's where I put the challenge out to you guys. But I think if there's a vision there that works, it maybe is another layer that solves some of the challenges or helps solve some of the challenges we have. So I really thank you. I also thank you guys, the Maryland planning folks for hosting this. And I want to thank Island Press. And by the way, Island Press tells me if you punch in SMART, it's a 30% discount on the books. So anyway, I hope I got that right. So anyway, I thank you very much. And please share your ideas on LinkedIn too.
Great, thank you so much.
Your criticism too. I like to see all sides of it, please.
All right, thank you. I like the theme of trying to find the win-win. So this concludes our webinar, Beyond Greenways, Next Steps in City Trails and Walking Routes. I would like to offer our deepest gratitude to Bob Searns for his presentation and for the engaging discussion and questions. Thank you to everyone who attended today and to John Coleman, who helped make our webinars run smoothly. We apologize for the technical difficulties at the start of today's webinar. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short survey. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience. All attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation for your use in claiming other continuing education credit. Keep an eye on your email box for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.